The first time I found the drawings, I thought it was just another mess I would have to clean. The crayons had rolled under the couch. The walls were streaked with color. And my son sat in the middle of it all, silent and calm, his small fingers tracing invisible lines in the air. The sunlight from the window hit his cheek. And for a moment I froze. Not because of the chaos, but because it looked deliberate. He wasn't just scribbling. He was seeing something I couldn't. His name is Eli, and he is 8 years old. He doesn't talk much, only a few words, sometimes none at all for days. Doctors used words like spectrum and developmental disorder, and they wrote prescriptions that filled drawers but never seemed to fill the silence between us. When he was born, he barely cried. When other babies reached for toys or faces, Eli watched light move through the curtains. When he was 5, I tried to take him to an art therapy class, but he froze at the sound of the teacher's voice. He didn't like noise or sudden hands or rules. He liked walls. Blank walls. To me, they were just walls, but to him, maybe they were doors. That morning, I stood in our living room surrounded by color. The walls bloomed with shapes, circles, lines, spirals that crossed one another like wind currents. Some parts looked like storms, others like people. And though I didn't know how to read them, I could feel something in them. It was as if emotion itself had found a way to live on plaster. I should have been angry. The rent was late, the landlord was strict, and every inch of that wall was now a confession in color. But when I looked at his face, I couldn't bring myself to yell. He was humming, softly, rhythmically, his own kind of language. I'd never heard him so peaceful. "Eli," I said gently. He didn't look up. His eyes moved with his hands, tracing red into blue, blue into yellow. "Sweetheart, we can't draw on the walls." I tried again, kneeling beside him. He paused for a second, tilted his head as if hearing me through glass, then went back to drawing. That was how it always was. Me speaking in one world, him listening in another. That night after he fell asleep, I tried to wash the wall. The colors smeared but didn't vanish. They only blended, softening into a kind of fog. I gave up halfway, standing there with the sponge in my hand. I noticed the way the colors melted into one another, like sunsets over water. It was beautiful, I thought. Terrifying, but beautiful. The next day, when I picked him up from school, his teacher met me at the gate. Mrs. Lang was kind but tired, in the way only teachers of special needs children are. He had a quiet day, she said. He spent most of art class under the table again. She hesitated, watching my face. He's not disruptive, just somewhere else. I nodded because I didn't know what else to say. I wanted to tell her about the wall, about the way the colors seemed alive, but the words felt silly. What kind of mother boasts about graffiti? That evening, I found him in the hallway drawing again. This time he'd used a pencil. No color, just thin, intricate lines like threads. When I looked closer, I saw a pattern. Rows of circles connected by lines, repeating, growing smaller toward the corner. It looked like something mathematical or musical. I didn't understand, but it was undeniably intentional. He turned to me then, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracked from disuse. My heart stopped. It was the first time he'd said that word in weeks. "What is it, Eli?" I asked. But he only touched the wall, then my hand, as if that explained everything. Later that week, the landlord came. He was a tall man with a voice like a door slam. He saw the walls and frowned. "This needs to be painted over," he said flatly. "I can deduct it from the deposit, but it has to be white again by next month." I nodded, ashamed. I wanted to explain that it wasn't vandalism, that it was language, that it was my son trying to exist. But all I could say was, "Yes, of course." After he left, I sat on the floor and cried quietly, because I didn't want Eli to see. He was watching from the doorway, his expression unreadable. Then he walked to me, took a crayon from his pocket, and began to draw on the edge of my shoe. A tiny spiral, small enough to fit on the leather. It was like he was telling me not to be sad, that everything he did was meant to comfort, not destroy. And for the first time, I understood something. He wasn't drawing to decorate. He was drawing to connect. Days turned into weeks, and the walls became his canvas. The kitchen, the hallway, even the bathroom, Every space bloomed with color. I should have stopped him, but every time I tried, the air in the house dimmed, like someone had taken the light away. So I let him. I let him draw and hum and fill our home with color, even though I knew someday someone would make us erase it. I started taking pictures when he wasn't looking. Hundreds of them. Close-ups of tiny shapes, corners of walls, smudges that looked like faces. I didn't know why I did it. Maybe to remember. Maybe to prove that something beautiful had existed here, even if no one else would ever see it. Then one afternoon, something changed. I was cooking, the radio low, when I heard a knock. It was Mrs. Lang. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, holding a stack of papers. "Progress reports." She hesitated at the doorway, looking past me into the living room. "Oh my," she breathed. I froze, ready to apologize, but she stepped closer instead. "Did Eli do all this?" I nodded, nervous. "He draws all the time," I said. "I'm trying to—" But she cut me off. "This is extraordinary." Her eyes moved across the walls, scanning the patterns the way you might study constellations. "Do you see this repetition?" She murmured. "He's creating sequences, patterns that echo each other. It's like he's composing music visually." I didn't understand, but her tone made me tremble. For the first time, someone wasn't seeing the mess. They were seeing him. She pulled out her phone and asked if she could take photos. "Maybe I can show these to a friend," she said. "An art therapist I know." I said yes, not because I believed anything would happen, but because her voice sounded like hope. It had been so long since I'd heard that sound. That night, Eli fell asleep with a paintbrush in his hand, though I'd never seen him use one before. I watched him breathing, his face peaceful under the yellow light. The walls around him glowed faintly, as if reflecting something alive. I thought of all the times I'd wished he were normal, all the therapy sessions, the doctors, the forms, the fear, and I realized that maybe this was who he was meant to be. Not someone to fix, but someone to see. Outside, the wind moved softly against the windows. Inside, my son dreamed in color. For a week after Mrs. Lang's visit, the house felt different. It wasn't just the drawings on the walls. It was the way I looked at them now. What used to feel like a problem had begun to feel like a secret, world opening quietly in front of me. I started noticing things I hadn't before. How Eli chose his colors according to light, not pattern. On sunny days, he reached for blues and yellows, soft and transparent. On cloudy ones, he pressed the crayons harder, carving storms into the plaster. One afternoon, I found him standing on a chair, stretching his small arm as far as he could reach to finish a patch of red above the doorframe. The curve looked deliberate, part of something bigger that continued across the ceiling, winding above us like a river. He was humming again, that same wordless tune, and I realized I knew it, the hum he made when he was happy. For months I'd feared silence from him. Now silence had become sacred. Mrs. Lang came again on a Thursday evening, this time with another woman. She introduced her as Lydia Hartman, an art therapist from the city. Lydia was quiet, dressed simply with eyes that noticed everything. She walked slowly through the rooms, her fingers grazing the air just above the walls, as if she could feel the rhythm without touching it. "Did he paint all of this alone?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Mostly crayons and pencils. Sometimes he mixes things, chalk, soap, even bits of dirt." "That's not mess," she said. "That's instinct." She took a camera from her bag, not the big kind, but small and quiet. "Would it be all right if I took some photos?" Eli froze at the sound of the lens opening. I could see his shoulders tense, his hand gripping the crayon tighter. Lydia noticed, lowered the camera, and crouched to his height. "Hi, Eli," she whispered. "Can I watch you draw?" He looked at her without answering, studying her face the way he studied patterns, cautious, curious, never quick to trust. After a moment, he turned back to the wall and began to draw again. Lydia didn't move or speak. She just watched, breathing in rhythm with him. It went on like that for almost an hour. When he finally stopped, she showed him the screen of her camera, a photo of one of his drawings. She zoomed in on the lines until they filled the whole display. "You see that?" she said gently. That's beautiful. He looked at the glowing image, his reflection flickering in the screen, and for the first time, he smiled, small and fleeting, but real. That night, after they left, Lydia called me. Her voice was different now, excited but careful. "There's something in his work," she said. "The repetition, the rhythm, the sense of movement. It's what we call autistic symmetries. It's not random. It's communication." She hesitated. "Would you let me show some of his photos to a colleague? He curates for the children's exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum." I almost dropped the phone. "The museum?" "Just to get another eye on them," she said quickly. "No promises, no expectations. But what he's doing, it deserves to be seen." After I hung up, I sat on the couch staring at the walls around me. The colors glowed faintly under the lamp. For months I'd seen them as something to hide, proof of how different he was, how far we lived from normal. Now they looked like a language written directly on our home. A week passed, then another. Life went on. School, therapy sessions, bills. Eli kept drawing. He'd started using small brushes now, thin and deliberate, like he'd always known how. He painted in silence except for his hums, and I let him. I didn't clean anymore. I didn't even try. The house became a kind of gallery, one only he and I understood. Then, one morning, Lydia came again. This time she wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, older, tall, with silver hair and paint on his sleeves. "This is Mr. Archer," she said. "He works with the museum program." He shook my hand gently, his eyes already drawn to the walls. He walked slowly, tracing the air with his gaze, sometimes stepping back to look at the composition as a whole. "How old did you say your son is?" 8, he nodded. "Remarkable sense of space. No formal training?" I laughed softly. "He barely speaks." Mr. Archer stopped in front of the largest section, the baggy one that wrapped around the living room, corner like a wave. He stared at it for so long I started to feel nervous. Then he turned to me. "Do you realize what he's done here?" he asked. "No," I admitted. "I don't think anyone really does." He smiled faintly. "He's built perspective without a single horizon line. Most adults can't do that." Eli had been sitting quietly in the doorway, half hidden. The man crouched to meet his eyes. "You're an artist, young man," he said. "A real one." Eli tilted his head, uncertain, then reached out and touched the man's. "Watch," the way he did when he wanted to. Understand something by feel. Mr. Archer didn't pull away. "We'd like to photograph some of these works," he said to me. "Properly. There's a program at the Museum for Outsider Art. Children whose language is visual. I think Eli belongs there." For a moment I couldn't speak. The word museum sounded too big for our small apartment, too distant from late rent notices and therapy forms. But then I looked at my son, sitting barefoot among crayons and color, and something in me cracked open. "If it helps people see him the way you do," I said. "Then yes, please." They came 2 days later with lights and equipment, careful to keep the noise low. Eli watched from a distance, sometimes curious, sometimes anxious. Lydia spoke softly to him the whole time, explaining each step, letting him hold the small lens cap. I made tea for everyone but barely drank mine. My hands shook too much. When they were done, Mr. Archer looked at me with quiet certainty. "I don't want to promise anything yet," he said, "but I think you should prepare yourself. The world is about to notice your son." That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor beside his bed, listening to his breathing. On the wall above him, colors glowed faintly in the moonlight. The shapes intertwined, suns and eyes and spirals that seemed alive, almost moving. I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of tomorrow. For the first time, tomorrow looked like possibility. They photographed the walls on a Tuesday, and by Friday the house felt like it was holding its breath. Every room was quieter, as if the colors themselves were listening for news. Eli kept drawing, but he had started to retreat to the hallway, choosing the narrowest place in the apartment, where the sound changed when you breathed. He would press his ear to the plaster, then draw in small, patient lines, as if he were answering something only he could hear. I tried not to hover, tried not to make the drawings into some fragile miracle I might break by naming. I made dinner, folded laundry, called the clinic about his therapy hours, and pretended I wasn't waiting for a phone call that might change everything. It came on Sunday evening. Lydia's voice was bright but careful, like she was holding a glass of water and didn't want to spill. "They want to meet him," she said. "The museum would like to invite you both for a visit. Quiet hours, no crowds. Mr. Archer thinks he can arrange a small viewing of the photographs in the education wing. Nothing formal yet, just a conversation." I looked at Eli tracing a spiral onto the baseboard with a piece of broken chalk. He hummed without looking up. I said yes before my fear had time to answer for me. The museum was bigger than anything in our lives. The morning we went, the city felt louder, sharper, crowded with edges that swallowed sound and spit it back. I packed a bag the way I did when he was little. Headphones, snacks, the soft blue scarf he liked to press to his face when everything got too bright. I held his hand on the steps, even though he'd started refusing my hand in most places. Here he let me hold it. The building rose above us in pale stone and glass, the doors opening like the mouth of a whale in a picture book. For a moment he froze, fingers tightening around mine. I leaned to his ear and whispered, "We're only going to look at our walls." Guard waved us through with a nod that said this had already been explained. They had prepared for him, signs with arrows, a small card with a map Lydia had drawn in turquoise pen, a route that avoided the main galleries and their noise. We walked through corridors that smelled of varnish and polished floors, past paintings so large they felt like weather. Eli didn't look at any of them. He kept his eyes on the silver lines in the tiles, and the pattern of light falling through skylights, his mouth moving silently as he counted in a rhythm he didn't share. They led us into the education wing, where light fell softer and someone had turned the thermostat down to the exact temperature he liked. There on the walls were his drawings, not the walls themselves, but photographs mounted with borders so clean they made my throat ache. The living room wave, the red curve above the door frame, the thin pencil threads in the hallway. It was our home made strange and beautiful, lifted out of need and turned into something you could stand in front of with your hands behind your back. He stopped when he saw them. The hum left his throat like a bird startled from a branch. For a long time he did nothing. Then he walked to the largest print and pressed his palm, flat and gentle, to the glass. The guard took a half step forward and then stopped, the way a person stops himself from reaching for a child who doesn't want to be touched. Mr. Archer stood a respectful distance away and said nothing at all. Eli traced his own lines through the protective surface and then stepped back. He looked up at me, blinking. His mouth opened and closed without sound. Then he took the scarf from my bag, wrapped it once around his neck, and stood in the middle of the room with his hands to his sides like he was waiting for cloth to become wings. Lydia crouched. "What do you think, Eli?" she asked, the words slow, spread out with space between them. He took a breath that sounded like the beginning of a sob, and then wasn't. "Blue," he whispered. And the word was so small and complete that I felt it land in my chest and stay there. The first misunderstanding happened on the way out. We didn't go back the way we came. The map had never accounted for curiosity. In the lobby, a wall of temporary plaster panels stood waiting for a children's workshop, blank and inviting in a way that most people don't notice. Eli noticed. He slipped his hand from mine with that sudden speed that feels like a door shutting, and in 2 quiet steps he was there, chalk pulled from his pocket with a magician's hand. He started to draw, one bright spiral on the perfect white. A security guard called, "Sir!" Not unkindly, just trained, and I was already moving, saying, I'm sorry, my voice brittle with a panic I thought I had retired. A few heads turned. A woman frowned. Someone clucked their tongue. The sound of the museum changed. It sharpened, but it didn't. "Break!" Mr. Archer appeared between us and the guard like a person stepping into rain, palms up, voice calm. "It's all right," he said. "Those panels are for mark-making." And he said it like the word mark-making was a spell that turned scolding into permission. "Let him finish," he added. "Please." The guard looked at his supervisor. The supervisor looked at the panels. And in that triangle of glances, Grace arrived. "Okay," the supervisor said. "All right. But And he made a small motion with his hand that meant keep it small, keep it kind. Eli kept drawing. The lobby hushed. A girl tugged her mother's sleeve and pointed. The frowning woman softened around the eyes. Lydia stood beside me, breathing as if the entire room might change if we did. When he lifted the chalk, the spiral had become a sequence. Small constellations nested inside a larger one, a pattern that didn't repeat but rhymed with itself. He dropped the chalk and pressed both hands flat to the panel like a seal. Then he stepped back and looked at it the way a person looks at water they're not sure is deep. A boy clapped once, because he didn't know not to. It sounded like a tiny firework. No one shushed him. We left quickly after that, both because I thought it was wise and because I could feel the edges of Eli's tolerance fraying. In the car, he lay on the back seat with his scarf over his eyes while I drove home, one hand on the wheel, one hand outstretched to the traffic, asking it to be kind. On Wednesday, the landlord called with the second misunderstanding. He had heard from the neighbor across the hall that the walls were getting out of hand. He said words like repainting and lease and liability. I said words like autism and accommodation and please, none of which sounded like money. He offered us a deadline. I swallowed it whole. When I hung up, I sat on the cool kitchen floor and watched the light move through the room, the way it always did mid-afternoon, striping the cabinets and making everything look briefly more expensive than it was. I told Lydia that night. She was quiet for a long time and then said, "Let me try something." The next day she arrived with a roll of large paper and a soft pencil and a trick I have since learned is older than museums. She taped the paper to the wall, edge to edge, turning our living room into a temporary skin. "If he draws," she said, "we can lift it. The marks will belong to the paper instead of the plaster." She showed me how to score the tape so the paint wouldn't peel. "This isn't a solution," she added, "but it might be time." Eli didn't seem to mind the difference. He accepted the paper as if it had always been there. If anything, he liked the sound. The damp whisper of pencil on heavy stock. The soft thrum when he pressed. He drew for hours that afternoon, then stopped as suddenly as he had begun, stood back and tilted his head. The composition was different than usual. 3 bands of color layered like weather, with a cluster of circles gathered at the lower corner like people who had decided to stand together just because. I photographed it in the hour before sunset when the room turns gold. By the weekend, the museum had sent a small team, 2 people, really, but their gentleness made them seem like more. They measured the paper, brought a portable frame, and lifted the drawing from the wall with the same reverence I'd seen once at a church when someone carried a candle. "Only if you're comfortable," Mr. Archer had said on the phone. And I heard myself answer that I was, even though comfort wasn't exactly what I felt. What I felt was a thin electric thread between fear and pride, tightened to a note I could not yet sing. At night, after Eli slept, I lay on the couch and stared at the lighter rectangles the paper had left behind, ghosts of white on white. I thought about ownership. Who owns a drawing a child makes on a wall that isn't his, in a home I can barely afford, in a city that never asked to hold us? I thought about exploitation, about stories of prodigies used like coins, about videos of strangers filming pain and calling it awareness. I thought about the way the guard had said sir instead of excuse me, the way the supervisor had found a place between no and yes, the way the lobby had changed shape around a boy with chalk. I wrote a letter I never sent. It said, "My son is not a commodity. If you want his work, you must also want his quiet. His refusal, his stimming, his scarf over his eyes in crowded rooms. You must want his no as much as his yes." On Monday, an envelope arrived from the museum. Inside was a simple sheet. Dates for a small installation in the education wing. Phrase suggestions for labels I didn't understand. And, tucked between them, a handwritten note from Mr. Archer. "We will move at your son's pace," it said. "The work will be presented as it was made, with humility and care. Eli does not need to become anything for us. We wish to learn how to make room." I carried the note to the hallway, pressed it flat against the wall with my palm, and stood very still while my heart learned a new rhythm. The day they hung the framed paper was the day a neighbor knocked with a cake, and an apology for her part in the landlord's concern. I didn't understand, she said, her hand worrying the edge of the foil. But my daughter, she saw him in the lobby, and she hasn't stopped, talking about the boy who made the wall sing. We stood in the doorway between our two apartments, both of us trying to fit our clumsy kindness into a space the size of a hinge. I let her in. She looked at the drawings and cried the way people cry when something forgives them. A week later, the quiet viewing became a small opening. Not a gala, not a press event, just a gentle afternoon for families and staff. They printed a guide with Eli's name at the top, and below it, mine. Works created in the home of Eli Smith, age 8, presented with the support of his mother. The line broke me and mended me in the same breath. He wore his scarf and his headphones. We arrived before the others and made a circuit of the room, me counting along with him until our steps matched the pattern of the floorboards. He touched the glass of 3 prints, then stopped touching, then touched his own wrist instead, transferring the impulse somewhere that wouldn't raise alarms. When people came in, he found the corner with the bench and sat like a boy waiting for a buzz that ran on feelings. A little girl approached, him with a drawing she'd made at the workshop table, a spiral in orange pencil. She held it out without speaking. He took it from her without looking at her face, studied the spiral and nodded once, as if they had agreed. She smiled and went back to her family. I slid my hand into my pocket and pressed my fingers into the fabric so I wouldn't cry in front of strangers. The way out? Another misunderstanding. Tried to be born and then wasn't. A man in a well-cut coat said to his companion, "It's charming what they can do, isn't it?" And the word they passed through my body like a small, cold wind. Before I could heat it with anger, an older woman near him said, "Simply, it's not charming. It's true." And the wind warmed all by itself. We went home in the half-light, the city reflecting the sky as if both had been polished. Eli fell asleep in the car with his scarf over his face and his mouth open like a baby's. Carried him upstairs, heavier than he'd ever been, and laid him on the bed that still faced the wall, where he first wrote us a letter in color. I sat on the floor with my back against the plaster and realized that I had stopped waiting for the world to bless us. It already had, in the simplest way, by seeing him and leaving him whole. A week later, the museum called again. They spoke about a program that buys work for the education collection, about honorariums and contracts, and words that made me feel like I had accidentally stepped into a language I didn't have the right to speak. "If you agree," Mr. Archer said, "we'd like to acquire the framed drawing from your living room. It would be presented as Eli intended, unframed within the frame. The edges of the paper visible, its story intact." I asked for time. I set down the phone and went to the hallway where the light was always gentler. Eli stood there with his pencil, drawing the smallest circles I'd ever seen him make. So small they looked like breath I could only see because I knew where to look. "Do you like the big paper on the wall, Eli?" I asked. He didn't answer, but he placed his palm on it and then on my chest, over my heart, and then back on the paper again. The gesture felt like consent, or maybe blessing, or maybe just a circle. When I called the museum back, my voice didn't shake. "Yes," I said, "but on 2 conditions. Asked that the label include the words created, at home and autistic communication. I asked that they schedule quiet hours for any events, and that they make the lights softer than the world would choose on its own." Over the line, I heard someone exhale the way a person does when they feel relief for 2. When we hung up, the apartment seemed to swell and then settle, like a boat adjusting to the correct number of passengers. In the kitchen, the cake my neighbor had brought was still on the counter, half eaten, the frosting gone hard at the edges. I cut a slice and ate it standing up, letting the sugar sit on my tongue like a small, sweet yes. That night, I dreamed of walls that weren't walls, of cloth and paper and air, of rooms open to the sky, of a boy in a blue scarf drawing on the wind. In the dream, no one scolded. In the dream, the security guard smiled. In the dream, my son's hands left color that did not have to be washed away. I woke before dawn to the quiet of a city that, for once, felt like it wasn't testing us. Eli was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his pencil. He had drawn a small circle on the baseboard, then another inside it, then another inside that. He looked up and saw me watching, then pointed. Circle. Circle, circle, home, home. Home, I nodded. Yes, I whispered. Home. We sat there together while the light rose, and the day began to make room for us. The call came on a Thursday morning, when the rain hadn't stopped, for 2 days and every sound. And the apartment felt softer because of it. I was making oatmeal, stirring slowly so it wouldn't stick to the pot when the phone rang. It was Mr. Archer again. He spoke with that careful balance of calm and excitement that I had learned to fear and love at the same time. It's official, he said. The museum board has approved the purchase. Eli's drawing will become part of our permanent education collection. I didn't know what to say. There was a part of me that had imagined this moment, that had let myself hope quietly. But hearing the words out loud made my knees weak. Permanent collection. The phrase sounded like something sacred, something eternal, something that didn't belong in the same world as rent reminders on the refrigerator. I looked at Eli sitting on the floor, tracing a wet line of condensation down the window glass with his fingertip. I wanted to tell him everything, that the world had seen him, that people cared, that his drawings would live in a place where light would fall on them forever. But how do you explain eternity to a child who only speaks in color? When we arrived at the museum that weekend, the sky had cleared. The air was bright and cold, the kind of day that makes even ordinary people look like they might belong to something bigger. Inside, they led us to a smaller gallery, a quiet, sunlit room off the main hall. There it was, his drawing, framed under glass, hanging on the wall with a small label beside it. The words were simple. Eli Smith B. Carcent Untitled Communication Sequence. Crayon, graphite, and mixed media on paper. Created at home 2023. I read the line 3 times. The last one aloud but too softly for anyone else to hear. Created at home. Somehow those 3 words felt like a miracle, proof that where we had once only survived, something extraordinary had happened. I glanced at Eli. He was standing perfectly still, hands at his sides, head slightly tilted toward the drawing. The light from the window caught in his hair. He looked like part of the artwork itself. There were people in the room, curators, teachers, a few reporters, but they kept their distance. Lydia was there too, smiling, her eyes glassy. He's calm, she whispered. That's a good sign. It means he recognizes it as his own. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. One of the museum photographers asked if they could take a picture of the 2 of us standing near the drawing. I hesitated. For years, I'd avoided cameras because they froze things I didn't know how to explain. But then I thought, this at least was something I could explain. I crouched beside him, but when the flash clicked, he flinched. I saw his hands twitch, the tension rise like a storm behind his eyes. I turned to the photographer and said quietly, "No more pictures. Please." The man nodded, embarrassed. The room seemed to exhale. Mr. Archer came over and handed me an envelope. "This is a small honorarium," he said, "and a copy of the certificate for the acquisition." Inside, folded neatly, was a check. I didn't look at the amount. Money felt so small compared to what was hanging on that wall. Beneath the check was a letter signed by the director of the museum, thanking us for contributing to the collective language of art and empathy. I didn't cry until later. In the car, the weeks that followed felt like living in 2 worlds at once. In one world, I was the same woman I had always been. I packed lunches, waited outside therapy rooms, fought with the landlord about heating repairs. In the other world, people were writing about my son. Local papers ran small pieces with headlines like, "Young Autistic Artists, Work Joins Museum Collection, Reporters," called the house. I turned most of them away, except one woman from a small magazine who promised to write about his art, not his diagnosis. She came with a notebook and no camera. She sat on the floor beside Eli and asked me, "Do you think he understands what's happening?" I looked at him, humming. drawing tiny circles on the edge of a grocery box, and said, "He understands everything that matters." One afternoon, Lydia called with another invitation. A children's art foundation in Chicago wanted to feature Eli's work in an upcoming exhibit about unconventional communication. I almost said no before she finished the sentence. The idea of putting him on display again made me feel like I was standing in a spotlight without skin. But Lydia's voice was gentle. "We can protect him," she said. "You'll decide what's shown, how it's presented. You'll have full control." That word, control, was one I hadn't felt in years. Maybe ever. I told her I would think about it. That night, I walked through our apartment room by room. The walls were mostly bare now, stripped of color and life. The museum team had taken photographs of everything before we repainted for the landlord. I missed the way the colors had breathed. The white paint looked clean but lonely. In the corner of the living room, I found a small patch we'd missed, a few faint blue lines hidden behind the bookshelf. I ran my fingers over them. They were cool and rough, like the skin of something sleeping. Eli wandered in, dragging his blanket behind him. He looked at the patch of color, then at me. Without a word, he took a pencil from his pocket and drew a small circle right next to it. I smiled through tears. "You found a place that's still ours," I whispered. He didn't answer, but I didn't need him to. The next day, I told Lydia we'd do it. The Chicago show, the next step. "We'll go slow," I said. "Only if it feels right." She promised it would. That week, we took the train for the first time in months. He watched the countryside roll past the window, his reflection superimposed on the fields. At one point, he pointed to the horizon, where the sky met the earth in a faint gray line, and said a single word, "Big." It was so unexpected, so pure, that I had to turn my face away so he wouldn't see me cry. He had never used that word before, but it was perfect. Yes, the world was big, bigger than I'd ever let myself believe. When we arrived in Chicago, the foundation had set up a quiet gallery for sensory-sensitive visitors. His drawing hung next to pieces by other children, some abstract, some joyful, all alive in their own way. Visitors moved through the room slowly, whispering, some smiling, some crying. I stood beside Lydia, watching Eli stand before his work, head tilted, his fingers fluttering in the air like they were tracing invisible music. A woman approached me, an artist, she said, whose own brother was on the spectrum. "It's rare," she told me, "to see a museum treat this kind of art as art, not therapy." I nodded, grateful and exhausted. She touched my arm. "He's changing something," she said softly. "You know that, right?" I looked at him, my son, small and quiet and endlessly alive, and said, "Yes, I think he already has." That night in the hotel, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window with his blanket, watching the city lights blink. I asked if he liked it here. He nodded once. Then he said, barely above a whisper, "Home?" I shook my head. "Tomorrow," I said. "We go home tomorrow." He didn't look away from the glass. "Home," he repeated, more certain now. Then he pressed his hand flat against the window, leaving a faint fog print in the shape of his palm. I understood then what he meant. The world had become bigger, yes, but for him, home was anywhere his hands could leave a mark. When we returned, there was a small package waiting for us from the museum. Inside was a catalog from the exhibit and a simple note from Mr. Archer. "Your son's drawing was the most visited piece in the room." People stood quietly in front of it for long stretches of time. Some cried. Some didn't know why they were crying. That's what real art does. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside Eli's scrapbook. He had already moved on, sitting in the hallway again, drawing another circle on a scrap of cardboard. I watched him for a while, the quiet rhythm of his pencil filling the room, and realized that the thing I had once tried to clean off our walls had become the light that filled them. The world had learned his language, and maybe finally I had too. It's been 12 years since the day the museum bought his drawing. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, other times, like a dream that happened to another woman in another lifetime. The apartment we live in now has bigger windows and sturdier walls. They're still mostly white, though not because I insist on it anymore. It's just how life turned out. Eli has his own studio now, a small space behind our house with sunlight that spills through, tall glass panes in the afternoon. He doesn't draw on the walls anymore. He paints on canvas, paper, wood, sometimes even glass. But every now and then, when he thinks I'm not watching, he'll reach up and make a single mark on the plaster. One circle, always in the same place near the light switch. A secret signature to remind us both of where it began. He's 20 now. Taller than me? His voice has deepened, though he still uses it sparingly. He speaks more through motion and color than sound. When he paints, it's like listening to a song without words, one you recognize even if you've never heard it before. There's rhythm in his movements. The same humming I used to hear when he was a child, the one that filled our small apartment. With color before I understood it was language, people talk about him now. There are articles, interviews, photographs. He doesn't attend openings, doesn't sign anything, doesn't make speeches. I do those things for him when I must, though I try to keep it small, human. He hates noise and applause, and I've learned to hate them a little too. What matters isn't the fame, it's that the world finally learned how to listen without interrupting. Every year, the museum invites us back. They keep his first piece hanging in the same place, in that small sunlit gallery off the main hall. They say visitors still stop there the longest, even when new exhibits open. Some stand silently, some weep, some just tilt their heads and hum without realizing it. Whenever we visit, Eli walks straight to it, as if pulled by gravity. He touches the air just above the glass, tracing the outlines he once made on our wall. I stand behind him, my hands folded, and I swear, I can still hear the old boiler pipes from our apartment humming underneath it all. Last spring, the museum asked if they could organize a retrospective, a collection of his works from the past decade. I said yes, with one condition. The exhibit had to begin with the story of that first wall, our home, and the mother who once tried to wash away what she couldn't understand. The curator agreed. They even recreated a small section of our old living room, complete with a faint projection of his original wall drawing across the surface. When I walked into the space during setup, I had to stop and catch my breath. It was like stepping back into the past, into a time when I was lost and he was still finding his way through the silence. The night of the opening, the gallery was lit low and warm. People moved slowly, their voices hushed, as though afraid to disturb the air. I stood by the entrance while Eli moved quietly between the pieces, his blue scarf still wrapped loosely around his neck. He's kept it all these years, the same one from that first museum visit. When he reached the recreated wall, he paused. The crowd behind him fell silent. He lifted his hand and traced a small circle in the air, invisible but perfectly shaped. Then he turned toward me. Our eyes met, and for a moment it felt as if the years had folded in on themselves. All the worry, the shame, the beauty, the understanding, collapsing into one single truth. Afterward, people asked me what that moment meant, but there are some things that can't be explained. It wasn't a performance. It was a conversation, one between a boy and the space that once held his voice before the world learned to hear it. That night, when we came home, he didn't go straight to bed. He went to his studio instead. I followed quietly and stood in the doorway while he set up a fresh canvas. The room was filled with the smell of paint and soft jazz playing low from a small radio. He dipped his brush in blue, then yellow, then white, slow. Deliberate strokes that curved into each other like breathing. I didn't ask what it was. I knew better now. He painted for hours, lost in the quiet rhythm. When he finished, he stepped back and let me see. It wasn't a person or a scene, or a pattern, just layers of light, folding over themselves. I understood immediately. It was sound, made visible. It was the hum that had filled our lives since the beginning. He looked at me, waiting for something. I whispered, "It's beautiful." "Eli?" He smiled faintly, a small flicker at the corner of his mouth, then reached for my hand and placed it on the bottom edge of the canvas. "Together," he said, the first full word he had spoken in days. It was enough to undo me. Now, sometimes when I walk through his studio in the morning, sunlight touching the paint. I can still see the echoes of the old apartment walls in his work. The patterns, the spirals, the small perfect circles that keep finding their way back, like a song replaying in another key. I used to think those drawings were his way of escaping. Now I know they were his way of staying, of holding on to something the rest of us had forgotten. People still ask me, when did you know he was special? I never know how to answer that. Maybe it wasn't when the museum called, or when his first painting sold, or when critics started using words like genius and visionary. Maybe it was the first time I found him humming to the wall, lost in his own universe, teaching me that love sometimes doesn't speak, it listens. The truth is, he was always special. The world just took a little longer to catch up. Last month, the museum sent us a photograph from the education wing. His drawing still hangs there, sunlight falling on it through the same window. Below it, a group of children sat cross-legged on the floor, sketchbooks open, crayons scattered like confetti. A teacher knelt beside them, pointing to the lines in his drawing. The caption read, "Art doesn't need words to speak." I stared at it for a long time before printing it and, hanging it above our kitchen table. Eli saw it that evening. He didn't say anything. He just touched the edge of the frame, then turned toward me and smiled. Sometimes I think about that little boy sitting on the floor of our old apartment, crayons in his hands, drawing worlds onto walls that no one else could see. I think about how I almost erased him, and I thank God every day that I didn't. Because in the end, it wasn't the museum that made his art immortal. It was love, the quiet kind, the patient kind, the kind that waits through silence and fear until it learns how to see. And maybe that's what every parent is meant to do. Learn the language their child already speaks, even if it's drawn in color on a wall the world doesn't yet understand. When I turn off the lights at night, I still catch the faintest glimmer of blue in the corner. Near the doorway, a mark from the first home we shared. I never painted over it. I don't think I ever will. It's my reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things begin as what we don't yet understand.